My name is Jill Norcross, and I'm the Executive Director of the Northern Virginia Affordable Housing Alliance. We welcome you today. Joining our team is Hannah Matuda, who's our Director of Policy and Programs. So thank you all for joining us about a really fantastic topic. Supportive housing is this month's Lunch and Learn topic. And we have such a great panel of experts for you today. I think you're really in for a treat. Here at Navaja, we're really proud and pleased to kind of promote this topics, which is a solution to a lot of the homelessness crisis that so many in our region are facing. And we're really pleased to have so many nonprofit partners, local government partners, advocates here joining our call. So thank you for being here. I don't want to take much more time, so I'm going to turn it over to our wonderful panelists, several of whom are part of our Rising Housing Leaders Network. So we're just thrilled that they are willing and engaged, and I know you will feel their enthusiasm for this topic. First, we have Candace Stansel, who's with the Lamb Center, and Shiri Yadlin with the Corporation for Supportive Housing. And finally, last but not least, Liam Hudson, also with the Corporation for Supportive Housing. They're going to talk to you a little bit about supportive housing in general and why it is a solution. They're going to speak a little bit about the Lamb Center's permanent supportive housing project with Wesley Housing in the city of Fairfax, and also talk about the Corporation for Supportive Housing's Supportive Housing Institute, which Candace participated in last year, that's coming up again this year. And we're really encouraging a lot of our partners to sign up for that free programming. It's intensive training, and you'll hear more about that with an opportunity to get some pre-development funding for your projects as well. So welcome to you all. I'm thrilled to turn it over to you to share all of your information and expertise with us.
Great, thank you so much, Jill. Give me a second to pull up our slides so you have something nice to look at while we're talking to you. Thanks everyone for being here, and thanks to Navaja for inviting us. My name is Shiri Yadlin. I'm with CSH, the Corporation for Supportive Housing, and as Jill said, joined today by my colleague Liam and a great partner Candace. Really looking forward to sharing with you. We're going to talk a little bit today about supportive housing. Just what is it? What does supportive housing look like? Why is it important? We're also going to share about the upcoming opportunity, the Supportive Housing Institute, and Candace is going to share some more personal experience with both the Institute and supportive housing more generally. So we'll get some theory and some practice today, and really encourage you all to use the chat to ask questions. We'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. Want to make sure that this is useful to you all. So we'll start out with just what is supportive housing. I don't know if you could maybe I'd love to know who has experience with supportive housing. You can put a reaction, something on, or emoji, like a smiley face or a thumbs up or wave or something. I'd love to know kind of who has experience with supportive housing. I see some familiar faces and names in the room, so I know there are some real experts here, but for those who are not so much familiar with supportive housing, it is deeply affordable housing with voluntary, tenant-centered, wraparound supportive services that really is aimed to end long-term homelessness and help set up residents to thrive, really using housing as a platform for thriving. And supportive housing is an evidence-based practice. There's been a lot of research behind it, and it combines these critical elements of deeply affordable housing and supportive services. And we often say that supportive housing is for folks who, without housing, would have a hard time accessing and making effective use of treatment and other kinds of supportive services in the community. But if they didn't have those services, they might struggle to maintain stable housing. So it's really the combination of those two things that are critical for making supportive housing what it is, which is a intervention to end long-term homelessness. Supportive housing can look a lot of different ways. There's lots of different models that there's supportive housing across the country. There's a lot of supportive housing here in Northern Virginia, in the rest of the state of Virginia, in the DC, Maryland, Virginia, DMV area. And it can look a lot of different ways, but there are some key elements that make supportive housing true supportive housing and make it quality supportive housing. And before I talk about those things, I want to mention what supportive housing is not. Let me pause for a minute and pull up the chat just to make sure that I can see it in case people have questions. So what is supportive housing not? So supportive housing is not transitional. It is not shelter. It's not a group home or assisted living or a licensed care facility. Supportive housing is permanent housing that is independent and distinct from institutional settings. A lot of people who live in supportive housing have experience with various types of institutional living, things like shelters, mental health institutions, jails, foster care, things like that. And often those experiences in institutional settings can be very painful. They can also be traumatizing. And so it's really important when we talk about supportive housing to distinguish supportive housing from those institutional settings because it is quite different. So with that said, what are some of these key components of supportive housing? Well, supportive housing, it engages with households with multiple barriers. What that means is often supportive housing is really designed for and focused on people who have maybe serious mental illness or intellectual or developmental disabilities, or maybe they have chronic health issues, or they're seniors, or they're transitioned aged youth aging out of foster care, or they're veterans, folks who sometimes have, in addition to being low income or extremely low income, also have some sort of other complex challenge that might make independent, or that might make non-supportive housing challenge to them. And so supportive housing has really been proven to drastically reduce the use of emergency rooms and jails and other kind of emergency and crisis services because it is often designed for people who are frequent utilizers of those kinds of emergency services. So supportive housing really engages folks who might have those sorts of complex challenges to maintaining housing stability in the absence of services. Supportive housing is also affordable. That's a really, really important piece of this. Supportive housing, tenants in supportive housing will pay no more than 30% of their income towards that housing. And supportive housing tenants are exclusively extremely low income. And often in the housing world, we talk about 30% AMI and below, but really supportive housing tenants are like 15, 10, or like 0% AMI. A lot of supportive housing tenants have no income or just Social Security or disability income. So housing in supportive housing must be affordable and permanently affordable. Another key piece of supportive housing is that tenants have a lease. And that lease looks like any other lease. So if one building has supportive housing tenants and non-supportive housing tenants, they have the exact same lease. There aren't extra barriers, there aren't extra requirements that a supportive housing lease has. Supportive housing tenants have the same rights and responsibilities as a tenant as anyone else, and the same kind of choice in their unit as anybody else. Another piece of supportive housing is that it is flexible, that there are flexible and voluntary services engaged with that. So we already talked about services being a key part of supportive housing, but those services have to be, as I said, flexible and voluntary. And what that means is they're really centered on the tenant. They're really recognizing that one person's needs for services or desires for services is going to look very different from another person's needs or desires for services because we're all unique individuals. And so services really have to be tailored towards the individual. That means there's lots of options of what kinds of services they might have access to. That means that there's a lot of conversation and engagement with the tenant to really be involved in the planning of their services. Services are also voluntary. They're not a requirement to maintain housing, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But they're really focused on preserving and encouraging and celebrating the unique individuality and humanity of each person, recognizing the culture that person lives their life with, recognizing, being trauma informed, being really just kind of intentional and thoughtful about how those services are delivered and how the tenant is engaged in those services. Another key piece of supportive housing is that there is coordination among key partners. So that means the service provider is talking to the property manager and they're working together to better serve the client. That service provider has good relationships with community-based resources like behavioral health resources, employment, education, treatment services, social supports. There's good connection with helping that person access benefits that they need, that ensuring those efficient linkages between the community, between the tenant, between all kinds of services that that person might be accessing is a really important part of supportive housing. And then finally, supportive housing is connected with the community, and it supports tenants in connecting with the community. And that refers to physical location. So where that supportive housing tenant lives, do they have access to public transportation and grocery stores and healthcare and all of the things they might need to thrive? But there's also social and emotional connections too. Like, is that having supportive housing, the stability of supportive housing can help set someone up on a platform to make social connections either in their community or like their physical community or their neighborhood. It can help them to find, build and sustain meaningful relationships. It can help them find social outlets, things like that. So kind of putting all of these things together, supportive housing really sets people up, as I've said, to thrive, sets them up to remain stably housed and live the life that they want for themselves, because that's really all any of us wants, right? So I mentioned that supportive housing engages households that have multiple barriers. And so we want to emphasize is that kind of the thing that unites every tenant in supportive housing is income. So it's extremely low income, but there are lots of different subpopulations that kind of all get that, many of whom can kind of access supportive housing and many of whom overlap. So this kind of complicated Venn diagram you see here on the screen shows some examples of those different groups of people. So we mentioned people at risk of institutionalization. So folks who are frequently cycling in and out of jail or hospitals or emergency rooms, things like that. People experiencing chronic homelessness or long-term homelessness, who also have sort of other kind of complex health challenges. And then this very acronym heavy circle here, DBHDS, the Virginia agency that oversees permanent supportive housing programs in Virginia. Their programs focus on people who have serious mental illness and intellectual and developmental disabilities. So oftentimes these populations kind of overlap, but they're all extremely low income. And the reason I kind of wanted to emphasize this is as a reminder that supportive housing, an added benefit of supportive housing is that it drastically reduces the use of things like emergency rooms, jails, hospitals, and those kinds of crisis systems that, quite frankly, are expensive in the sort of public funding world. And so there's a lot of research out there that supportive housing and effective supportive housing, quality supportive housing reduces use of those things. And actually, in addition to being like a very humane and effective intervention for the folks who are living in supportive housing, it's also a cost-saving intervention. The last thing I will say about supportive housing before I turn it over to Candace to talk more kind of personally about why supportive housing works and is important in a specific example, want to mention that supportive housing absolutely has to be in the housing first model. So for those who are unfamiliar, housing first is really this idea that, or this recognition that quickly housing people experiencing homelessness is the most effective way to reduce the trauma that is caused by not having housing and set people up for thriving and set them up for long-term stability and recovery. So by providing housing as the first intervention, the first support for someone in crisis, they have a better chance of remaining stably housed long-term and moving forward in their lives to true thriving. And so supportive housing really goes hand in hand with this housing first model. It's centered in tenant choice. It is low barrier. It really, that there's no requirements. You don't have to do all of these things and then you get housing. You get housing first, and then you can work on all of those things and you're set up better to work on anything else you might want to work on. So really important piece of supportive housing. Now, I have like totally sped through this very, very fast introduction to this concept of supportive housing. We can absolutely talk more about it conceptually or practically. If you have questions, encourage you to ask them at the end or put them in the chat and we'll get to them. But wanted to just give you that overview before we talk a little bit more specifically about supportive housing. And so I'll hand it over to Candace to talk about a more concrete example of supportive housing in the community of Northern Virginia.
Thank you, Sherry. Well, good afternoon. I am incredibly excited to share with you all my experience with the CSH Institute. But first, I want to talk a little bit about the history of the Lamb Center. In 1992, the Lamb Center opened in Fairfax City to serve those in need. Today, our agency provides stabilization supports and community navigation. Those supports include free meals, employment services, dental, and let us not forget our case management team's niche in reasonable accommodations and obtaining ID documentation to address equity challenges for our people. Most recently, the Lamb Center has created a joint venture with leading affordable housing developer, Wesley Housing. We plan to create the largest single-site PSH program in Fairfax County. I want to give a special thank you to Wesley Housing for their partnership in seeing our vision. We are very fortunate to work with such talented individuals like our project manager, Taylor Stout, where I can share a service need for our space, and like magic, Taylor comes through with a solution-focused design feature that works for everyone. So we thank you, Wesley family. But let's transition into our next slide about the needs of our project. In recent news, our PIT data shows that there are currently about 1,300 persons experiencing homelessness, with 257 individuals identified as chronically homeless. Fairfax County has identified the need for a minimum of 5,000 affordable housing units. Our program design features models learned. Our program design feature models learned practices through CSH with the hopes to address vulnerability of individuals experiencing homelessness with disabilities. But let's hear from our CSH team about why a program like ours is needed.
Thank you, Candace. And way to set the stage for the big why. And thank you, Shiri, for giving us a background of supportive housing. So why is this important, and why is this a helpful solution to ending long-term homelessness? Well, it really is the key component of the housing continuum, and it's absolutely critical to advancing racial and housing justice. It helps right, and it can't completely right a lot of the housing injustices and wrongs that have been done to some of the systemically marginalized populations that we encounter in the homelessness system, but it is one way to start providing some of that long-term stability to folks who may otherwise not have that. Also, supportive housing works. We know it works. There is extensive evidence to support supportive housing as an evidence-based practice. There are demonstrated outcomes that show the improved success of individuals who receive supportive housing and or receive affordable housing and supportive housing services. And it really has a very helpful long-term impact on integrating folks into the community and helping them become well established within their communities. And it has a lot of positive impacts on folks being able to establish those really critical and key social supports as well. And then, another thing about supportive housing is that it requires so many hands to really be successful, right? So it requires all of these cross-sector partnerships. It requires all of these minds coming together and thinking about a holistic way to support the individuals or the populations we're serving. It requires support on a government level. It requires support on a local level. It requires the support of the community and of the providers, right? So supportive housing really does touch so many different sectors of the community that otherwise would maybe not have the opportunity to be present in this way. We can head to the next slide, please. So now that we've kind of set the stage for supportive housing, we've heard from Candace and the Lamb Center, and I'm excited for you all to hear more about what they're doing and their involvement with the Supportive Housing Institute. But I'd like to give you just an overview of what we're doing. So yeah, we can go ahead to the next slide, please. Thank you. So before I get too deep into it, I just want to give a shout out to all of our amazing partners. And the Region 5 CSBs have been amazing. the Virginia Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Services. We're also collaborating with Navaha, who were kind enough to ask us to speak with you all today. We're collaborating with the folks at Virginia Housing, and we're also collaborating with the folks at the Virginia Department of Housing and Community Development. And as I mentioned before, cross-sector partnerships are absolutely necessary and vital to supporting the efforts of long-term sustainable supportive housing. And so the Institute is, our way of really solidifying and building those cross-sector partnerships and making sure that we have a lot of representation present as we are developing these institutes and as we are reaching out to folks like you all to make sure that everyone who should be present is represented. Next slide, please. Thank you. So with that being said, what is the Institute? Well, this is a CSH signature approach. We have developed to date, or we have delivered to date, 47 supportive housing institutes across 16 states. We do this in order to build capacity, provide training and technical assistance, and we do this in a really condensed period of time. It's 4 to 6 months. Ours will be 4 months, and we comprise teams of developers, property managers, and service providers. We put them all in one space throughout the entire process. And the goal of that is really, again, that cross-sector coordination, making sure that the development folks know exactly what the service provider folks are going to have to go through, and that the property managers are well integrated into connecting with the case managers, knowing when it's appropriate to maybe check in on someone, and really becoming more familiar with some of the populations that may be served in supportive housing. And we do all of this based on the CSH quality standards. And our goal is ultimately to significantly reduce the time that it takes to fund a project by helping build a really strong development team that's equipped to navigate the complex process of development, and also integrating those services. So those services piece is absolutely crucial. So how do we support the long-term sustainability, or how do we help you all start thinking about how to support the long-term sustainability of not just the structure itself, but the services that go along with supporting these populations. Next slide, please. So this year, we're really excited. Last year, in 2022, we did the Northern Virginia Supportive Housing Institute. We had 5 incredible teams come in. We were really excited to say that we had a 100% success rate. All of our teams graduated the Supportive Housing Institute, and then 4 teams ended up coming in for the project initiation grants at the end of the Institute. This year, we are offering a multi-regional institute. We're opening up to teams in Northern Virginia again. We're also opening it up to folks in Region 5 or the Hampton Roads regions. Again, because we are partnering with DBHCS in this, we really want to make sure that we are focusing on those populations that are most systemically marginalized. That has been identified as people at risk of institutionalization or currently in institutionalization in a state psychiatric hospital, including folks living with serious mental illness. And just so you all are aware, in case you don't know, you might see that shortened in other slides as SMI, but that's what that stands for, as serious mental illness. People experiencing or at risk of chronic homelessness, and then people cycling through crisis systems. So jails, prisons, other institutional settings, emergency rooms, things like that. And again, I just want to say, if anybody, I know I'm going through all of this really quickly, so if you have any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. We'll also make sure that we leave some time for questions at the end, but just want to encourage you all to interact in that way too. And, I know this is really, really quick. So next slide, please. Thank you. All right, so like I said, speaking of really, really quick, the Institute. The structure is going to be hybrid. We're going to do 13 interactive sessions over a 4-month period. We're kicking this off in August, and it's going to conclude in November. And so what we'll do is we will begin with an in-person 3-day session in Northern Virginia. We'll bring all of the teams together. It'll be a really collaborative space. It'll be time for the teams to get to know each other, because we also recognize that a lot of the partnerships that form the teams are new too, right? And so making sure that you all are well supported in, building your team and really developing a strong foundation, not only for the project, but for the partnership and sustaining a really strong partnership throughout the Institute and beyond. So we do this because with each of those interactive sessions, we're building from the last session. And so we want to make sure that you all have the platform, the foundation, and really solidify those partnerships early on, so that when we get to the hybrid sessions later on, we're not losing any of that sort of connection, that we're still developing ways to stay connected, to make sure that this project and this partnership is really at the front of our minds. We do that in a couple of ways. We do that by having ongoing technical assistance that CSH and other area experts will provide to you all. We do that by having little homework assignments that the teams will then submit. And then they're not necessarily graded like homework, but part of your TA will be providing feedback on the assignments. And the goal of those will be at the end, you can apply them directly to your project. A lot of them are helpful in mapping out projects, both from a development and operations standpoint. And so, again, we are going to be doing this year, starting in August, the very beginning of August, and then we're going to conclude in November with another in-person session that corresponds with the Virginia Governor's Housing Conference in Hampton Roads this year. So making sure we really are able to visit and be a part of both of the regions. We do have, there are some pretty strong team commitments that we expect. That each team can have 5 members. If you incorporate a tenant or a person with lived experience, which is strongly encouraged, teams can be up to 6 people. All teams have to identify a team leader. The teams must have a plan to incorporate feedback from members of the priority population into their project. So again, beyond the person with lived experience on their team, we also like to see that there are processes in place for ongoing and continuous feedback, because that's what makes supportive housing so successful, is that it's person-centered. And so making sure it's person-centered also means making sure that we have the ability to adapt as needed. And then one of probably the most critical point that I can make is that all team members must attend all sessions. We understand that things come up, there are emergencies, but we also try to be very transparent with our schedule and with our timelines, and just want to make sure that you all are aware of the commitment before entering into it, and that you're well prepared for just kind of the expectations and ground setting. So next slide, please. Okay, perfect. Yeah. So now I'm just going to turn it back over to Candace so she can provide you a little bit more of a personal experience on what it was like for the teams to go through an institute. So take it away, Candace.
Thank you, Liam. Well, let's chat about this unique experience. Our agency had the opportunity to participate in workshops and remote work that influenced our project in real time, as well as really awesome field trips. This experience also expanded my knowledge of different approaches for service providers and developers to utilize while building a quality PSH program. These activities also allowed our team, the stabilizers, to receive support during our entitlement period, such as different ways to integrate community supports. The small work groups were very practical and provided a safe place for agencies to troubleshoot project vulnerabilities. My peers and I collectively identify areas of advocacy outside of the Institute, like lack of funding for supportive services and navigating NIMBYism in our communities. We also explore various ways to incorporate persons with lived experience. Currently, we are in process of naming our project. We strategically included participants in the process and hope to do more activities in the near future. This is a great time for us to transition into our next slide about best practice in supportive housing. I found this experience to be incredibly affirming. In the past, I attended CSH training workshops that were very helpful. However, this was my first time partnering with a developer. Oftentimes, due to my funding stream, my agency would act as property manager and a linkage service provider, which can be demanding. The Institute allowed my agency to create a project design built on the dimensions of quality. We learned how to operate within our established roles to ensure that residents will receive tenant-centered services that reflect their requests. We also explore funding to ensure that our program is accessible and affordable for our target population. This project is coordinated and documented to reflect our commitment to quality improvement, meaning we plan to regularly find ways to evaluate our program with the hopes of enhancing our operating agreement to benefit our residents and community needs. This experience also prepared us for community integration. It goes without saying we will have the finest apartment on Fairfax Circle, but learning about community integration also allowed us to focus on how we plan to operate and collaborate with our neighbors on Campbell Drive. Furthermore, we continue to explore ways to ensure our program is financially sustainable over time. Housing preservation should always be a top priority. But I'm sure you want to hear updates about what we've accomplished since the Institute. So let's look at the next slide. Since participating in the Institute, our project has come a long way. In December of 22, our project was entitled, which was no easy feat. We purchased the Highway Motel shortly after that. We are incredibly blessed to have scored well with our LIHTC application and hope to close in June. And we can go on to the next slide. And we completed phase 1 and 2 of our environmental review with phase 3 in process. We also hope to demo the existing building in the fall. Our construction process is slated to begin in Q3 of 24. That includes, but is not limited to, hiring, tenant selection, move-in coordination. Well before that, our agencies will utilize information from our trainings to guide us through this process. To date, this project has secured funding at the city, state, and federal levels. As I close out, I want to do a big thank you to CSH for endorsing our project and their contribution to the community to ensure that providers and developers have solutions to vulnerable people experiencing homelessness. 10 out of 10, I highly recommend attending CSH Institute as you build your project.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Candace and Liam and Sherry. Really appreciate it. Yeah, you'll get copies of the slides, hopefully with everyone's contact information. You can reach out after the fact, but we have plenty of time for questions. If anybody has any, please feel free to put it in the chat, raise your hand, or just even come off mute if you want. I know it was a lot of information about supportive housing in general, about the Lamb Center and Wesley Housing's project, and about the Supportive Housing Institute. So feel free to ask questions about any of it. So I see a question from Gwen. How do you address the challenge of getting a person with mental health issues to sign a lease and other paperwork needed to get this housing and accompanying support services? Great question. Not sure if any of our panelists have had experience with that and can share some best practices about getting them to sign the lease.
So I can hop in first if you guys want to add on. So I think one of the unique things about going to the Institute is that we it was not only Fairfax County who was part of this, but there were other communities outside of Fairfax County. So I believe there were I think there were some people from Loudoun, but I say that to say each continuum is very different. In our county, for people who are chronically homeless, we have a coordinated entry process. And oftentimes before they come to us, they are working with another service provider. So oftentimes whoever that individual is, they have a rapport with that person. We tend to be very flexible in Fairfax when it comes to the lease signing process and understanding that it may take some time for them to come around, but we try to be as trauma informed as possible when we're utilizing that approach. But we like warm handoffs as people come into PSH or into our supportive housing projects. So just as long as we're having that transparency, we try to be as flexible as possible for them to process getting into the lease. But sometimes we've seen some people where it takes them a while to come around to the lease before we can get them into housing.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I think that's one of the reasons why supportive housing is so important, is because it allows that kind of relationship, that time, and that flexibility to, recognizing that someone might have barriers to moving inside. We might think like, you're getting offered a place inside to live and you've been living outside for years, like of course you would jump at that, but that's not always the case. Often people are leaving community they've established. There's lots of fears that they might have about being in a totally new place, being inside walls that's confining, that's different. So there's a lot of things that go into that kind of transition, and being really one of the beautiful things about supportive service providers and supportive housing is the creativity that is often involved in providing those services. We were talking with someone recently that they didn't have, the person had been sleeping outside for so long, and they didn't, they were nervous about coming inside for all kinds of reasons. And so they managed to work with the landlord to put a hammock outside this apartment building, or it was a smaller building, like more like a house, outside, and that person slept in the hammock, like outside the front porch for a few months before they came inside. And that was part of that partnership and that coordination between the landlord and the service provider, and the tenant themselves were able to kind of help that person make that transition. So lots of creativity and kind of understanding of the challenges that someone might be facing.
And I definitely want to highlight too, Sherry, just the idea of addressing the barrier for them and asking, what actually are your concerns about the lease? What can we do to help you understand what that means? Because sometimes, even though we want the lease to look a lot like everyone else's, sometimes we really have to break down, like, no, this is what the lease is meaning. It says this, but let me help you understand it a little better. And that does take some time.
And I'll just add, I think social supports, external social supports are underutilized. If folks have a friend or a sibling or a family member or someone that provides them that social support, sometimes just having them there to tour the apartment or to help them review the paperwork. I think, recognizing that even though case managers may not feel like they have a lot of power in their role, there is a lot of power in asking someone to sit down and sign legal documents and kind of having the authority, seemingly having the authority of those documents. And so any way that you can rely on social supports to also help folks feel more comfortable reviewing those documents and understanding what they're signing, I think is helpful.
Thank you all. So just a quick follow-up question. So someone with no income or very low income could reside in the housing for the rest of their life, even if they refuse to take advantage of the support services. Is that correct?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it is. And I think something that's important to recognize with this is that the voluntary aspect of the services is really about humanizing every person and recognizing that the situation you might be in with your income or your living situation is one that doesn't mean that person has any less agency over their life and their choices and what they what they're subject to, the requirements they're subject to. And so recognizing that and the real power in kind of honoring people's choice and honoring their agency and dignity you find that people want those services. They want to engage, they want the support and help and relationship. And so that's the most common situation you see in supportive housing, is people taking advantage of the services they need and the services that they want that goes along with that housing.
And I believe, Sherry, there might be research about this, but from my personal experience of operating supportive housing, it's normally few than it is majority of people who are not engaged. And oftentimes the engagement challenges are due to the systemic traumas they've experienced. So for majority of guests, and that's why we also highlight the quality of services and services that are attractive, services that they are telling you that they want. If you are creating services based off of needs that don't match their needs, they're probably not going to be willing to engage. But we oftentimes see that when we do surveys and we're asking for feedback and we tailor the supports to what they're asking for, we see a lot of increased engagement.
Great, thank you. Another question from the chat is if you could talk a little bit, maybe Candace first, about your specific experience with the Lamb Center property, and then maybe Sherry and Liam have like some broader comments about navigating the process of locating a good spot for permanent supportive housing. And, you know, obviously thinking of dealing with cost, proximity to resources, and also NIMBY mindsets.
So I am going to answer, but I'm also going to open the floor to my executive director, Tara. I can see she's on the call, so thank you. But I believe we had actually looked at many sites before we narrowed down to the current site that we have. And I think we may have saw a sign, or that was how we learned that that might come up, and it was just that happened and we were like, let's get on it. That's what I recall, but there may be more to that. But we also, which I did not include, but we also hosted community education sessions so that people understood the needs of the community and what we were looking to do and how we were going to do it, but also opening the floor so that if they could not make it to our community meetings, they had the opportunity to give us a call, to drop in, or send us an email to ask more about the project. But Tara, did I leave anything out about how we selected the location, the wonderful amenities that are really close by to us?
No, you did a great job. I would just add that we had a lot of conversations with our local partners in the city, and I think that's important. We're in Fairfax City, so a small jurisdiction, and we talked with the mayor and the council individually and collectively, actually for a period of years, you know, while we were doing our due diligence about what our goals were. And so it was really a shared conversation about what type of a site would be right. And when we did find, we had a lot of misses before we landed on what would be best, but it really helped us when we identified the site where we are actually building. We knew it because we'd spent a lot of time thinking and talking about what would work from the city's perspective and from our perspective. Of course, we knew that being located near resources for residents so that they could shop and access public transportation were essential. The NIMBY factor, we had a clear dialogue with the city, so we knew what their threshold would be, and they knew what we needed as well. So I would say, please don't overlook your local jurisdiction, or if it's in Fairfax County, talking with OPEH and others about and the Board of Supervisors about your goal, and bringing them in so that they can become advocates and supporters, and that you're addressing issues before you go through the entitlement process, which is challenging. And then lastly, with the neighbors, just lots of community dialogue. We held formal sessions and informal sessions. We met with neighbors. We had a number of mailings. You can't over communicate on this. And that is very tricky. And I would just say more is better. We also found local advocates within the city and within the county that supported us. And so it was a lengthy process and a complex process of community engagement.
Thank you. We got some more questions, so maybe we'll move on to those. Can our speakers talk about sharing your thoughts on having all PSH units in the same building versus scattered and integrated with non-PSH units?
Yeah, so I would say the probably unhelpful answer to this is it very much depends. I think on your community, like on where amenities are, what the makeup is, what the density is, what that specific site and what else is around it. I would say that there are certainly advantages and disadvantages to both from a services side, from a funding side, from a community side. And so the reality is, like, we need supportive housing, so we need as much of it as we can. But I do also think there are places, and we would say at CSH, there are places where it doesn't make sense to do 100% permanent supportive housing building. If it is really isolated and kind of in its own little world, that's not integrating people within the community. I think the driving metric is how integrated are these tenants of supportive housing with the broader community. Now, if it's a super densely populated area and there's a lot around, you know, the Wesley Lamb Center building is 100% supportive housing. It's within a broader community that if you look at the community as a whole, it's not all supportive housing. And so it gives that kind of integration, even if it's all one building. The advantage of that one building is it's more units. It's a place where you could house services within it, and so have a lot of things on site for the tenants. However, in other places where it might not be as densely populated, having just one 100% supportive housing building can be really isolating. And so I'd say it really depends on your community and what the needs are.
And then I also wanted to speak to the to people's needs. And when you're working on the front line, one of the things we see is that some guests, they want people they are familiar with. They want to be close to service providers. They want to be in a place of familiarity. But then there's some people where they're like, I want to move on from life. I want to put this situation behind me, and I would prefer to be out into the community and not so much seeing people that I do recognize from my experience with experiencing homelessness.
That's really important, Candace. And I'll just mention one more thing, that concept of choice, I would say, is one of the most important pieces of supportive housing as a whole. And so even with scattered site programs, which is where, you know, you are providing the services and maybe the rental assistance, but in units all around the community, that's like, then a tenant has choice over where they want to live. If it's this one supportive housing building, maybe there's choice of which unit, or choice of whether they want to live in a fully PSH community or somewhere else. And so it's almost like critical that we have lots of different types of PSH, where it's site-based, where it's scattered, where it's a mix in one building, so that there is the most choice possible. Because that's really the key thing about, once again, going back to that concept of like owning agency and dignity.
In our coordinated entry process in Fairfax County, we have an application that guests do with their provider before entering housing. And in that application process, we describe the different PSH models in our community so that they can prioritize the ones that they are willing to engage with.
That's great. Great points. Thank you. Can you talk a little bit about how the Lamb Center's relationship with Wesley Housing came about?
So I am going to defer to Tara about that because of her hard work and energy that she went into looking for this. But what I will say is I remember a lot of heartache, and then I remember big celebrations. So go ahead, Tara.
Well, we're very lucky. First of all, I'll say we landed with just the right developer, and I think that's important because, as their wonderful former CEO would say, it's like a marriage, and it really is. We talked to several developers, and we just knew when we found Wesley, we found mission alignment with them. You know, our roots are in the Christian tradition, and so are theirs. We just found they were very excited about what we wanted to do. That was something they wanted to add to their portfolio, was working with that lowest AMI population. Just on a very personal level, their competence and expertise is well recognized. So we knew we had a great partner, and I think they saw in us that we really had the services piece. And so it was a nice alignment of interests. You know, they have expertise in their area and we have expertise in ours, and both are needed in the PSH. And so that's how we got together. But we benefited from having spoken with several groups before we actually settled on Wesley. And so we kind of knew what we were looking for. And I would just add one last thing. When you're talking with your prospective partner, I think really understanding and identifying what each organization uniquely brings to the project is super important. And Wesley really helped us with that. And the Institute helped us with that. That was a big part of the Institute focus is identifying your partner's strengths. And that was really helpful.
And I'll just to clarify or add to something. So, you know, Wesley and the Lamb Center, their team was a real all-star team in the Institute, and I think had really modeled partnership for the rest of the teams. But every team, and I think Liam mentioned this in the Institute overview, every team is made up of developer representative, property manager representative, service provider representative. So it's all kind of one of the goals of the Institute is to help kind of form that team more solidly. And so encourage any folks who are on the call who are interested in that Institute, like if you're a developer, you know, finding a service provider to join with, or if you're a developer interested and you want help finding a service provider, like CSH can also help make those connections for you too. But it's natural that these are different types of organizations that don't work together often. And so there's gonna be some hiccups in making those partnerships happen, but that's part of what like this process is about, is forming strong relationships. And there is not a cost to the Institute. Liam, if you want to say more about that and how finances work.
Sure. Yeah, no, this institute is offered free to all teams. And the way that we're gonna have it set up is we are accepting 5 teams from the Northern Virginia region and up to 5 teams from the Hampton Roads region or Region 5. And these are completely paid for through DBHDS and Region 5. They have been very generous partners and they're very supportive of this initiative. And so much so that this year we are also able to offer $10,000 capacity grants for teams to participate in the Institute. And we're hoping that some of those funds will be utilized for the support of persons with lived experience on the team to support their travel and just real fulfilling participation in the Institute, but that is not a requirement of receiving those funds. We will also be offering $300,000 in a project initiation grant at the end of the Institute, and all folks who graduate the Institute are eligible to apply for those funds. So up to $310,000 in grant funding is available for all teams. And yeah, otherwise the technical assistance, everything else is free, no charge. And we also provide ongoing technical assistance within the project initiation grants. That's also of no charge.
And before you answer the next question, I just wanted to highlight how fun it was. This is not like going in the classroom, and we were literally in the middle of conversations. We're talking to each other, we're engaging with each other. And even as we were going through this process, we were doing homework, and it was homework. I don't like calling it homework because homework's never fun, but it was like real actual work as we were doing the exact practice. So as we were doing our community engagement and our supports, we're literally building plans to match it. So it was just all happening at the same time. And it was a great time. It was great to work with our peers who were not even on our team, but we all had the shared concern. So it's a really fun experience.
That's awesome. Thank you. And so amazing to have those extra financial resources to complement the training that I know is so important to you all. We're getting close to the end, but we did get a couple questions from the survey that we kind of put out when you registered. And I think it's really important that we talk about this too, is can you talk a little bit about what actions local governments can take, and also what actions advocates can ask for that can help us, expand successful supportive housing programs in our communities?
Well, I'll start. I think one showing up today is a great start. Some local governments learning more about supportive housing and what it could really do to benefit the populations in their community. Across the board, it has reduced cost of almost every sort of system interaction there is. Including the justice system, health system, the mental health system. And so, it is a cost reducing implementation as well as a very long-term, sustainably supportive intervention for homelessness and a lot of the things that contribute to homelessness. I think another thing local governments could do is start understanding funding sources and how to braid funding sources to support projects long term and and look beyond just supporting the development of projects, but supporting the operations and building in funds to support the operations and the services as well, and really showing a commitment to this sort of intervention.
Yeah, and to just get a little bit more specific on that funding piece real quick. So by operating, like what Liam's really talking about is rental assistance. So, these projects require, as we said, they're deeply affordable. So they really require a rental subsidy. Often that can come in the form of project-based vouchers from the Housing Authority. So working with the Housing Authority to dedicate some project-based vouchers to the project. But it can also be, other from the local Department of Human Services, a specific rental assistance program that can go towards supportive housing, or there's lots of creative ways to do it. So the rental assistance funding, and then the services funding is often one of the hardest pieces to plug the gap. And we know in Virginia, there's not really great sources for services funding, and the Lamb Center knows that well. And so coming up with unique sources of funding for that is another big piece.
Thank you. Thank you all. And I think, just following up just as advocates, having these talking points when you are out in the community, really being able to speak to the importance of permanent supportive housing as a solution to our homelessness challenges is really key. We'll be sharing the slides, so you'll get some of, the messaging from the Lamb Center and CSH, hopefully that you can be sharing as you go out to advocate for more housing resources in our community.
Oh, and on that note, just really quick, sorry, Jill, the Lamb Center talked about their challenges of facing of their how much planning they did, talking with the community, but they had some NIMBY challenges as well. But having people show up at those community meetings to be the fighters against the NIMBYs, to be the YIMBYs, to be the yes, we want this in our community, that's so important. So that is one thing you can do, is show up in support of these kinds of projects.
So well said. Yeah, I think it was really the first time I saw that the speakers in favor of a project, outweighed by far any of the people who were speaking out against it. Because I think, once again, it speaks to a solution to the challenges we're all facing. So that's really what excites me most about this work, and really can't thank our panelists enough. Candace, Liam, Shiri, thank you so much for sharing your expertise. Great job. Hope you will have their contact information for those of you who joined us today, and we will be sharing slides, and also really interested in your feedback. We're happy to do kind of a deeper dive into supportive housing later this year, because we know there's a lot of information to unpack. So thank you all for attending, and we will see you next time. Thank you.